Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. There are 49 folks that are attending. Jeff, I want to kind of turn it over to you for this morning to kind of kick it off.
Great, thanks, Joe. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the CBTS CIO Exchange. My name is Jeff Lackey. I'm the president of CBTS, and we thought, given the virus and the crisis that it's created in today's world economy and the health and wellness of the world, we thought that we would try to provide some thought leadership to our customers around a couple of key topics that I think all of us on the call today are navigating, and that's business preparedness. How do you make sure that your company is ready for the unknown and the planning that typically goes into it? And we've got some folks on the call here today that will help kind of walk through how they've handled and navigated these sorts of crises in the past. Really, one of the underpins of all of this is leadership during that crisis. And again, first time through one of these situations can be very scary. Some of the folks on the line here have again experienced similar situations in the past, and I think they bring some very good practical ways of helping navigate yourself and your teams through this time of crisis. So with that, I will turn it over to Joe Putnick, who's going to moderate the session. And we hope that you get some value out of it. And if there's any questions or follow-ups, please let us know. We'd love to be of additional service. Joe, take it away.
Thanks, Jeff. So good morning, everyone, again. Please note that all attendees will be muted and the video will be turned off for your connection, really mainly to avoid the connection qualities. And we want to make sure that we maintain a best program as possible for you. During the presentation, please type any questions you have into the chat panel. You'll notice, Eric, if you want to go back one slide, you'll see, if you don't see the chat panel, right above Jim's head shot there's an icon. It's at the bottom of your screen. Myself and Tim Beck will be consolidating those questions as we go along, and then be asking questions of the panelists and of the hosts. So Eric, if you could, we'll just quickly go through the agenda here. So we talked about the welcoming and meeting goals for today. Go through the agenda briefly. We've got Kevin Murray on, who is going to be speaking on behalf of Cincinnati Bell's pandemic preparedness. We also have Russ Mayer. Russ actually is part of our board and has 4 years experience within the IT realm. And he'll be covering IT leadership in a crisis. And then we also have some panelists that have practical experience with inside of the space as well, and that's Dave Burns. He's Chief Information Officer from GE Aviation, the current. And then Jim Fowler, who is Executive Vice President and Chief Technology Officer at Nationwide. So with that, Eric, and then we'll do Q&A along the way. As the email said before the meeting, we're going to do this in probably about a half an hour window and leave about an hour open for Q&A, because that's really where we believe the value to be. So Kevin actually comes to us from Cincinnati Bell. He's our Senior Vice President and CIO for all of Cincinnati Bell. So Cincinnati Bell, including CBTS, Hawaiian Telecom, and Onyx. And his areas of responsibility include all of IT for all of those companies. And as I said earlier, Russ, who is an active board member of Cincinnati Bell, but also has a wealth of experience in 40 years of IT. And a lot of that happened to be inside of the GE arena, but also Boston Consulting, and a couple of stints as CIOs of a couple of steel companies along the way. We talked to Dave a little bit. So Dave is the acting CIO, as I said earlier, and Jim is the active Executive Vice President and Chief Technology Officer of Nationwide. So those are our panelists, and those are our presenters. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Murray, who will take it away.
All right, thanks, Joe. As Joe said, my name's Kevin Murray. I'm the CIO for the company, and before I get started, I think it's important from a contextual standpoint to just talk a little bit about how Cincinnati Bell has changed in the last few years. Several years ago, we acquired Hawaiian Telecom and Onyx IT services. And Cincinnati Bell in total, our IT organization is supporting roughly 4,500 employees. And people always think, well, that must be just in Cincinnati. With those acquisitions and with our growth, really only about half of those 4,500 are now located in Cincinnati. The rest are located elsewhere. We have over 1,000 employees in Hawaii, several hundred in Canada, several hundred in India, and then hundreds more throughout the United States. So that's relevant because we're going to talk about helping support a remote workforce, and I wanted just to touch on that from the start. Our IT organization is roughly about 450 FTEs. Roughly 300 of those are outsourced to two key providers. Those providers, the largest of which is Accenture, we are supported from service centers in multiple service centers in India and the Philippines, as well as onshore presence in Cincinnati and in Hawaii. So if that helps paint a picture as to kind of what we were thinking as to how we were going to get through this, we have people all over the place these days. And Eric Miller, who helped put this together with Christy and Jeff, and Joe, they wanted me to talk about how did we transition to a successful work from home model. And I'm going to talk about that with just a couple of slides today. So Joe, if you can go to the next slide. So there's two different ways I'm going to cover. I thought it was important when I started to document what we did. It was all from an internal perspective, internal IT, but there were some corporate-wide things that helped as well, and I want to hit on those first. So Joe, next slide. So this font's a little smaller than what I hoped for, but I think there's a few really key points on here. Cincinnati Bell has an established business continuity program in place that has evolved over the years. We were service continuity focused, 5, 6, 7 years ago, and that has gradually graduated into a business continuity focus. That has helped because we have a defined playbook. We've got roles established, who's in those roles, who are the decision makers, and that has helped us make decisions more quickly in a crisis. And this BCP team meets daily at 1 o'clock, and I can say it's been very helpful for me as an IT leader just to plug into that, to hear throughout the business and be able to make sure we've deployed our resources appropriately. I also wanted to mention the communications to our employees the last few weeks has been particularly good. Our CEO, he sends out a daily blog to all of our employees, and it's very refreshing. It is very transparent. He focuses on what are the key things he's thinking about, how do employees need to be thinking about it, what is he worried about. He talks about, kind of impacts to people's families, his family, but above all, he stays positive, and people have really responded well to those. We also issue daily HR health updates to people on how to stay safe, or how to stay safe during this time, how to access health services. We've provided multiple portals to our employees, one that allows them to ask questions for our senior management team to answer, and we have a centralized everything COVID-19 website. And above that, all of our leaders are encouraged to meet frequently with their teams. A couple other points are our departments. I mentioned the BCP program earlier. All of our supporting departments have really stepped up and helped, in particular, my group kind of prioritize what we need to do on their behalf. So that's been incredibly beneficial. And then lastly, from a kind of a corporate-wide contributor, we named a dedicated enterprise program manager, which has helped oversee and coordinate a lot of these activities. And, I was in a conversation yesterday with someone who said, that person has been really, really critical to kind of keep everything on track. So with that, I'll focus on what we've done specific to IT. Joe, if you can go to the next slide. All right. So I went back and looked at my email as to when we kind of got started on this, and that's kind of a relevant term because you can't prepare for something like this overnight, and you can't really prepare for something like this in 45 days. But my first message to my team was in early February around making sure we were prepared. And fortunately, we had a number of things that we had evolved us over the years that really put us in a pretty good position. But the very first assumption we made was we had to prepare for the absolute worst. And that meant all of those people that I described to you on the outset, they were all going to be working remotely across the globe, and that included our service desk. We went through some adjustments and tests to make sure that our VPN capacity was good and that our internet bandwidth capacity would be good. And we're even going to expand those further in the upcoming months. But for now, they're holding just fine. We are a very highly mobilized company, but we still have a small portion of our user base that uses desktop PCs. We had to scramble over the last few weeks, which we were largely able to do, particularly in Cincinnati, to get laptops in the hands of those that needed to take those home. And for those who didn't, we have options like Citrix for them to do their work from home. Collaboration tools existed. Office 365 and OneDrive were particularly important as it reduced the reliance on our corporate network. And over the years, like I'm sure many of you have, we've evolved with more and more SaaS packages, which also helps offload traffic from our network. We air-gapped our resources as best we could, particularly those that are out there trying to get equipment and laptops to people so that we don't have them all working together in case one were to get sick, it could spread. And for those of you who have call center groups or network operations groups, you know that they have unique needs, and we've dedicated people to them. Last couple points. Before this all kind of went the way that it has, we made sure that several critical processes could be run remotely. One of those was payroll, and you take that for granted, but in the last 20 years in Cincinnati, we had never run payroll remotely, and there was a lot of cross-checking that those resources do throughout the day as they're running payroll. So our team moderated that, helped watch that through when those folks were working from home. And then, communication, as I mentioned earlier, is key. The IT leadership meets. We meet every afternoon to talk through issues. And then, Joe, my last slide. So what are we not able to do, and what are we still working on? And this changes. My slides are about 48 hours old, and this has already changed. The first point hasn't. So although we are happy with our internet bandwidth capacity, my team isn't actively encouraging the use of WebEx video meetings that are connected to our VPN. We're not discouraging it, but we're not saying to go over the top with that use because we want to preserve our bandwidth. It would be nice if we could really encourage that. And we will be able to after we have a pending upgrade coming in the next month. But by and large, that's all working out pretty well. People are using the macro network for those. We did have an issue in Hawaii with our laptops, so we've had some people working remotely with desktop machines. We dealt with some issues with latency for those developers that I mentioned that are in India, but we solved that yesterday, which is good. And then, we're still using mostly Skype for Business. And we were in the process of trying to roll out Microsoft Teams, but we weren't quite there yet. So that's something that'll be done in the back half of the year. So hopefully that helps set up a little bit of what we've been working on in our own IT organization for you guys to be thinking about maybe what you're doing or where you're headed. And I think it would be great, later in the Q&A for us to share some information. But that's what I had, Joe. I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. And I think with that, I'll turn it back over to Russ here as we keep moving on, and so we can keep to a quick time frame. Russ? Hold on, Russ, you're on mute.
There we go.
There you go.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks everyone for joining us. In times like this, it certainly seems that we face an awful lot of the same issues, and some of them are really tough. And there certainly are on our families, our friends, feeling some level of isolation in the middle of a crisis within our businesses as well. So thanks for everybody for joining, and a special thanks for Kevin, Jim, and David to join me, because they got some incredible experiences as well. If you flip to the next slide, Joe, thank you. I thought I'd give you the experience I have gets down to, I think, these 5 areas that were the toughest crises I faced. So my perspective is more around, it came from a conglomeration of these 5, but I'll focus more, I think, on the ones that came out of aircraft engines. I learned a bunch from some of the others. Aircraft engines was an amazing time in our lives. But the first one there was I joined a steel company, a very profitable specialty metal steel company, several $100 million, very profitable, had to be separated by virtue of a consent decree with Justice Department. And lo and behold, within 12 months, the guy that had acquired it privately had taken the money out of the company, and it died. And as the company went from a couple of thousand people down to the last 12 of us left, that was for me, very early in my career, one of the biggest crises that I had. That was the biggest crisis that I faced at that time. The second one was clearly in 2008, where Wall Street melted down, the capital market shut down. That was something that jeopardized so many businesses. It was very difficult inside of GE as well, given the cash, the needs of the cash, and how GE Capital worked, and being able to get money from one place and lend it to others, and so on, how that business worked. All of a sudden, the money that our sources of money just instantly, almost overnight, dried up, and causing huge strain across the business. The third one was a virus that after we had acquired a company, they connected our networks, and someone introduced a virus, and it went from that company extraordinarily fast. Within minutes, it had shut down all of our entire business that was interconnected. And it was one of those that jammed the network full of stuff so that you couldn't even get on the network to see where it's coming from, who's infected, that kind of thing. So that was a significant crisis. The fourth one dealt with after I joined our healthcare business, the FDA, one of the companies that we acquired, who had great market share, like 70% of the market share for the kind of stuff that they do, and great customer perspectives. The FDA said, you're just not good enough. And they gave us a warning letter, and we significantly improved it, but it wasn't good enough, and they shut it down. And the last one was 9/11. So I'm going to get next after this. So what did we do about those? And what did we learn from those experiences? So in 9/11, I was actually in a Lockheed Martin defense plant between Baltimore and Washington, D.C., underground, when the first plane hit. And someone in the basement where we were had a black and white TV with rabbit ears, and it was fuzzy. And we thought, my gosh, must have been one of those small single engine planes. It turned out not to be. And when that second one hit, we said, oh my gosh, we're under attack. Nothing flew. And our home is in Cincinnati. We kept our Hertz car and we drove it home, and there was chaos about around the country. If you call those times, it was certainly a challenge. Joe, if you flip to the next page. So here's what I would what I think worked well for us. And I won't say we always did them right either. In each one of those situations that I talked about, some of them apply more. Certainly the three areas that I show here around thinking broadly and deeply, clearly start with the employees, their concerns. How do we keep them safe? We had people during 9/11 that needed to go somewhere, or were in the process of going from France to Germany for something. Where were they all? how do we get them home safely when the airlines weren't running? Do we know exactly where they're at? Can we connect up with their families to make sure that people were safe and their loved ones knew where their employees were? That kind of thing. We got connection with the employees, I think was enormously valuable. As Kevin said, the daily kind of connection about what's going on, listening for a big chunk of those communication sessions about questions, comments, new ideas came out that were really very, very helpful in shaping what we decided to do. So we learned a ton from each one of those kinds of crises that I showed on the prior page. On the business side, in each one of these, it was around focusing on what's happening with our customers. So in the case of the attacks in 9/11, certainly all the domestic travel was required to stop. So the aircraft engines business at that time made the bulk of its money from its services side of the business. And as soon as you stop, the services stopped. The company was paid in many cases based upon the number of flight hours, and those flight hours stopped on 9/11. You recall those times. So we went from a very profitable company to, oh my gosh, for major parts of the company where we actually made money had stopped overnight. So what do we do? And what are our customers doing? So it got us to focus on things like looking at what we needed to do to understand where our customers were and what we could do to help their situation. At the same time, also looking at how do we make sure that if a customer wants us to rebuild a couple of their engines or so on and put a bunch of money into it, how do we ensure that they have the capability to from a cash perspective and so on, to be able to pay for that stuff that they're asking for? And in some cases that was a pretty easy decision. In other cases it was very hard. So we actually invested more effort into getting a better insight and better analysis on that customer financial situation, so that we did not jeopardize our business further in having these guys go bankrupt with a big amount of money owed to our company. And on the community side, well, what can and what should we do to help our communities and our neighborhoods through these kinds of situations? So I know it really warms me when I see companies that stand up and do something to help others, and it's not necessarily right in there. They weren't required to do it, but boy, they stood up and did it. And that is a wonderful kind of company to be associated with, if you can figure that out. And I think IT, with the capabilities that we have and what we bring to the table, I think that's something that is a great responsibility for us. In terms of leadership skills, I thought about this one for a bit as well. And I went back and I looked at other big leaders that are all over the place on the internet, around guys like Churchill and Kennedy and so on. Pick your set of favorite leaders, and they all have some set of skills that they believe that really mattered most to them. So I tried to boil down what the 4 or 5 that I thought were that struck myself and struck people that I talked to the most. The first one is to be transparent with the team, be a positive force, and be honest. I love the fact that someone like Lee Fox talks not just about what's going on at work, but even in his own home, how this is affecting them and what they're doing about it. So it's a great time to be transparent, not to be hiding. It's a great time to build the team. We will get through this together. So that was one that I think is really big. The second one for big leadership to me is being very visible. If you have we used to walk around during those crises. It's not so easy to do today with all of our lockdown process, but finding a way to be visible is the key here. Be visible, not just in them seeing you, but in having that back and forth communication. And having visible leadership I think is really critical, especially during a crisis and after a crisis. Listening as a skill of the leader becomes even more important. It's listening to not just the staff, but across the business leaders, down below the business leaders, down inside of our own organizations, listening to the customers, the community, but listening becomes an extraordinary skill that I think leaders during the crises must brush off and do even more. Refocusing the calendar, because the things that we need to do in a crisis, we all go just do. But a lot of us do things that are perhaps less needed during this time, and delegating routine things, getting out of those routine things to give you more think time and more time to do the things that we have been talking about and that Kevin talked about, I think is a very, very key way to make it happen, I guess. Over communicating, almost can't communicate enough during these times, but especially two-way communication. One way is great. You have to have the ability to have two-way communication, and in many cases, trying to take those communications, and despite having very large global kinds of organizations, make it more friendly to the time zone and so on that of the folks that you're working with. So times where we were up at midnight talking to people in China and Japan and so on, and that was certainly a challenge, but I think it's really, really critical to do. And then think beyond the current crisis. So Joe, if you'd flip the page, is going to be important. So this was 9/11, and I'll just touch on a couple of the points here. To me, the first thing that we needed to do is get deeper into the key issues we're trying to solve. Well, clearly we're not. Folks aren't flying. Well, what does that mean to us? Well, cash is going to become critical. Margin is critical. How do we cut out cost today that have major impact today? So any new the normal stuff that we would all do. So I won't cover that around projects and so on. But there are a couple of things that we started doing and spending money on that we hadn't been doing that before. Things like the analysis of customer financial situations and so on. So we didn't put our company at even further risk by essentially lending customers that looked like they were going to go bankrupt within the next few weeks. What do we do to protect the company during those times? And is there anything we can do to help the customers as well? I think another place we used the communication capability was to get feedback on what's working and what isn't working. So specifically asking people, how are the conference calls work? Are we getting the work done? How would we get it done better, faster, easier for you? What would you like to do that you feel like we're not doing or can't do? And that back and forth conversation and feedback on those mechanisms that we're putting into place very much helped. Last thing I'd point out on this one is that it was such a traumatic time for our country, and it struck people. You just don't talk to anybody who didn't felt impacted by by this September the 11th crisis. So recognizing people, which I'm sure is a great talent anytime, a great skill to use anywhere, but even more so during these times, and appreciating what people do is critical to our long-term success and to how our employees feel. Joe, next slide, please. I'm going to jump to, I kind of covered the left-hand side, manage the crisis, but then as we explore new ways to work at home and so on, think about which ones of those processes, and actually take time to think through which of those processes are actually superior to what we had been doing before. So how can we extract that learning out of there? So as we get over the crisis, we don't go back to doing kind of what we were doing before. What are the parts and pieces that we're going to change? And we can leverage from this learning. Another one is that in the past we thought about vendors as how do we manage our vendors and so on, but we learned from managing vendors to vendor partnerships, and a very different way to approach and learn as well from what vendors see about our own behavior and their ideas about how we can improve what we're doing. Became a delightful way to learn and get better. I think the thinking about how we apply lean and agile, how we get simpler so that we can react faster to changes and so on. And it isn't so hard for our employees to get work done and valuable work done. The last thing I think it did for me, I would say, is it caused me even more to focus on our customers. So I think after we got through this period, I talked to our then CEO, Dave Calhoun, about, he said, well, now you've done all these things, what are we going to do next? And that was a couple of years into being at Aircraft Engines. So I decided to focus a lot more of my time with customers, and that, honestly, that changed me personally forever. Before I thought I was pretty customer focused, but I spent a lot more time with customers and with heads of engineers and COOs and CEOs and so on, and it made such a difference. Our employee attitude scores were wonderful. Go ahead, Joe, you would, to the next slide. So we did meet every financial goal. At that time, we didn't need to lay off, but we did reduce a lot of our contractors. There were times in my life that I've had to do that, and it's hard to do. And I try to avoid it every chance you get, and I know the folks here do as well. But I would tell you the thing that felt the best was that we measured employee morale. And in each of the companies that we went to and applied the things that we were just talking about, employee morale went from one of the worst in GE. It always seemed to me they like to send me to places that didn't have very good morale. And in this case, it was about the worst in GE. And another business I went to was the worst in GE. And within a year and a half, 2 years, it went from the worst to one of the best, if not the best. So it works certainly from an employee perspective. The businesses also looked at us and in the same kind of survey and measured our performance, their perception of our performance, and in every case went up substantially to one of the strongest partners within the business. So these things actually and others certainly added a lot of value, both perceived value and real value within our company. So with that, I think that was the last slide I was going to present. If we could, there are two people that are marvelous leaders. David Burns, and I've worked certainly both in the GE, and now he's the CIO for GE Aircraft Engines. And Jim Fowler, I've known almost your whole life, Jim, I think. Certainly a good chunk of your work life. And I've smiled as he went from one big job to another, and then suddenly one day he was leading all of GE Information Technology, which is remarkable. Challenge at an extraordinarily challenging time, and now at Nationwide. So, David or Jim, do you have anything else you would highlight or have a different perspective on or emphasize from this last few minutes?
Yeah, so Russ, why don't I start? First of all, thank you to the Cincinnati Bell team for the opportunity. This is a great opportunity to kind of share some of the things we've gone through and also learn from others. So I appreciate that. I thought I'd just maybe start with two things. One, kind of highlighting how we're prioritizing work within our organization during this crisis. And two, some of the things that we're reminding our leaders as we lead our people through this crisis. So if I first start with how we're prioritizing the work of the IT organization and the broader company, first and foremost is a focus on worker safety and health. You know, we are identified by the U.S. government as a critical manufacturer because we support the U.S. military and we support the flying public, including cargo transportation that is moving medical supplies around the world. So while many businesses have the majority of their workers working from home, we do have a responsibility to keep our operations running. So making sure we're doing everything possible to protect the health and safety of our employees is first and foremost on our mind. The second thing for me is security. This is a window, and we know our adversaries will take advantage of crises to exploit the crisis to gain access to our intellectual property or other information. We are seeing an increase in attempts to phish our employees, to get them to click on links that look enticing about COVID-19, things you can learn, sensationalized headlines that are actually trying to get credentials out of our employees. So there's a lot of things we're doing to ramp up our focus on security through this crisis. The third area that we're focused on is operational stability so we can continue to support our customers. Obviously, we do have to support a significant transition of people working from home. And, you know, we've got to manage our quarter close process with many of the individuals in our financial processes working from home. So we're doing a lot there to put it in perspective. We have, as I speak to you, about 160,000 people around the globe remotely connecting into our operational systems. So it's quite a daunting task, but a lot of good work going on there. And then lastly, and Russ, you spoke about this, the business model today for aircraft engines is similar to when you were there. So we have to aggressively target cost. But I'm also very focused on making decisions for the long term. How do I make sure the decisions that we're making as an organization position the company for success on the backside of this crisis, and making sure we don't make short-term decisions that put at risk the long-term success of the company. So I look at this as an opportunity to accelerate some of the strategic change we need to drive as a business. So those are the areas that we're looking at how we prioritize the focus of the organization. A couple of the things that we're reminding our leaders, and Russ, there's a lot of common threads to what you were saying. The first is, in a crisis, nothing stays secret. So we have to act with integrity. We are reinforcing to our employees there are no cutting corners just because we were in crisis. We need to make sure we follow and uphold all of the rules and regulations and the spirit letter of how we run our business, first and foremost. The second thing is focus on the main issue unrelentingly. You know, you talked about rethink how your calendar, how you spend time in your calendar. At the end of the day, making sure we are not being distracted by things that are not critical to the crisis, and refocusing how the entire executive team of the business is focused and how all the people leaders in the organization are focused on those priorities I talked about earlier. The third thing, and this is something I'm pushing with my team, is don't leave me out there or other leaders out there to make bad decisions. Push back. At times of crisis, you've got leaders have to make quick decisions. And in those times of quick decisions, it's important if someone's making a bad decision to say something. So I know the aviation executive team has spent a lot of time wrestling with how do we deal with some of the employee health and safety issues? How do we deal with some of the cost decisions that we're going to have to make? Now, more important than ever, is to have a good, valid debates on tough decisions before those decisions are made. And then, you know, probably the last thing that I'd say is, and this goes back to Russ, your points about communication. At times of crisis, I've found that people want competence out of their leaders, not necessarily just nice. And so being direct, being transparent, over communicating is really the mantra with how we're operating. And I'll give you a perfect example. On Monday of this week, we had to announce that we're going to reduce 10% of our U.S. workforce. That is not an easy message to deliver. And the reality is we came out and told our employees of that decision before we had gone through and fully vetted which employees would be impacted by that. We felt it was important to be open and transparent to help them understand the gravity of the situation for our business, and that we would have to make some very difficult decisions in the short term to protect the long-term health of the business. And actually what we've found over the last 2 weeks as the bottom has been dropping out of our industry is our employees, as they understand the gravity of the situation, appreciate the transparency and are rallying behind supporting us through this time. So those are just a couple thoughts from my side. Why don't I turn it over to Jim for you to share your perspectives?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And again, thanks to the Cincinnati Bell team for setting this up. I'm not going to repeat what everybody else has said. You know, Nationwide is in the business of basically making promises that we keep. And if you looked at the news this morning, you saw there were a series of tornadoes in the South last night. And this morning, our customers who had homes that were destroyed or damaged, or businesses that are destroyed or damaged, they really aren't thinking about the pandemic. They're thinking about, how do I get back into a house? How do I get my business back up and running? And so for us, planning is really important. And so very much like Kevin talked about, we declared a pandemic disaster January 29th. We spun up our DR teams at that point. On March 11th, we made the call to move home. And by March 16th, we had 100% of our associates, including our call center employees, working from home. And the reason that we do that is because of those tornadoes that hit yesterday. We know that we can't miss a beat when it comes to missing those promises. So the only thing I want to add is maybe what comes after that point, right? So we do all this planning, we get our workforce from home, we start working in the crisis. How do you get back to normality? And so the two things that I would add that we've been focused on, one is our people. Their anxiety is as high as it's ever been, and making sure that we're addressing their needs as individuals, we recognize as being very important. So spinning up nurses, spinning up teledoctors, spinning up the ability to talk to a counselor, to make sure that we're dealing with the associates inside the company has been a focus. And then from a technology perspective, going back to good old failure mode analysis. What now are the failure modes that weren't important until you work from home? Like CBTS and Cincinnati Bell, we're a big user of Skype. All of a sudden, our Skype volumes have tripled in the last 2 days. This has now become a mission critical application. So we've started talking about what's our failover plan? What happens if Skype goes down? What's the fallback? So a lot of our time and effort this week, now that we've gotten everybody transitioned to home, has been, what are the new failure modes that we didn't have to plan for before that we need to think about now? Another example that came up this week is we've all talked about over communicating. Last week, we started a series of video broadcasts that our CEO, our senior HR leader, the finance leader, and myself are doing to all associates every week. We know how to do that when we're sitting in our facility. When everybody's sitting at their house, we're not quite sure how that happens. So we literally spun up tiger teams this week to deal with how do we make sure those communications can continue to happen, focused on what are those needs that occur now that didn't occur when we're sitting in our own facilities. So that'd be the only thing I would add. I think everything else that everybody else said is kind of right on the mark. It's about over communicating. It's about making sure that you've got a technology plan that can scale. It's about making sure that you are listening to the needs of the customer and making sure that you're addressing those needs as quickly as possible. And so I'll shut up, because I think all I'd be doing is repeating everybody else at this point, and just turn it back to the group for Q&A.
Thanks, Jim. So a couple of questions have come in. So Russ, back on one of your last slides, you were talking about employee morale, and one of the questions were, how did you measure that morale before and after?
Yeah, GE had a like once a year, once every 18 months, back in those days that I worked there, and they would ask 50 or 60 questions, if I recall properly, about a number of different topics. And one of them was always, given the importance of IT inside of the company and inside of the future of the company, there were always several around that. There were a couple around, how about your peers at the same level? You know, how do you feel they're performing? How do you feel? Do you feel good about that? So we would get, and you'd be able to cut the data in lots of different ways. And we got the view of employee morale, both for a starting line basis, and then after the crises when they occurred, and you could compare those results. So you knew how the business felt about you, you knew how how my staff felt about me, and how the organization felt about me, both in IT as well as the outside, our business felt about what we were doing and what I was doing. So it was a great way to get a broader view, a temperature gauge, I guess, if you will, about how we were doing, and then what we needed to do differently from those perspectives.
Here's one that just came in as well. And Kevin, I'll post this to you and others, because Dave and Jim, you may have assets as well in India. But how is CBTS addressing bandwidth issues due to call centers being in India and the infrastructure restraints?
Well, in our case, our outsourced providers there are responsible for that. Accenture and Netcracker. So they like us. They have business continuity plans in place, and they were responsible to make sure that their bandwidth was up to speed. We do have our CBTS India employees there that are connecting over the VPN. And we are aware that in some cases, some employees may not have the best bandwidth in general coming from their homes, but that hasn't arisen yet as call it a major issue at this point.
Hey, this is Jim. I'll add on this one. I got to be honest. So we have 3 different companies that we work with in India. They're struggling this week. The move to the call from the state governments to say that associates couldn't come into the office anymore, even with essential services where they were allowed, we're finding that they've really fallen down. 1, they don't have the VPN capabilities. 2, they didn't have enough laptops for their associates. And 3, the local internet has been an issue for us. And we actually have been in a couple of situations this week where we've gone and breached a contract with a couple of customers, and we've had to execute our plans to bring some work back to the United States. Now, luckily for me, our call centers, our customer-facing call centers, all sit in the United States, so I don't have it from a customer perspective, but we are seeing it from a production support perspective in the technology space. I think that's going to be one of our key learnings coming out of this, is their BCPs were not well tested, and luckily we had backup plans in place, but they've not done well.
Jim, if I could add something else.
Yeah, please.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to go to the next question. If there's relevant content, let's continue to have the discussion.
Jim made me think about this from another dimension as well, which thankfully we haven't run into, at least I haven't heard of us running into it yet in this situation, but it certainly did during 9/11. And that was that we lost some of our critical employees. During a crisis, sometimes not only we're spreading them out, but some of our folks could get ill enough they just can't do their work. So have we thought through the most critical things that we need to do, critical people, and make sure that we actually have access to the right documentation, the right stuff in case they are ill, our business can continue to run.
there's a follow-up question on the disruption piece. Are you talking to customers about the disruption? Going back to the transparency piece, Dave and Russ, is it something that you would bring forward to into the conversation?
We have our customer-facing teams very actively working with our airline customers and our military customers. So we have not seen business operation disruption that has impacted our customers to date. We do have to figure out how to protect our supply chain. We've got suppliers all around the globe, and as individual localities and municipalities put controls in place, if and when we get to a situation where we will have a customer impact, we do have teams staged to have those conversations, but more of our focus with our customers to date have been what can we be doing to help them weather this crisis.
We've got a couple of questions that came in, and I'm going to consolidate them, hopefully here together here. So do you worry about productivity for the remote workers? And if so, how are you ensuring it's sufficient? I think a lot of that has to do with extra things that are going on now in the home. You've got kids that are home, so you've got homeschooling, you've got dogs. How are you communicating to your teams for support of that? So making sure that they're being productive at home, but also, managing the family and managing the stress associated with that.
I'll take at least a start of a crack, and I'll bet there's some very good thoughts from other panelists as well on this one. But I take a little bit of a humor perspective on occasion. First, we do talk about it. This is a challenge to work at home. Because in the past, you could walk out the door, you get in your car, you're in a different place, and you don't have the worry about the kids running around and what do they got to do, and homeschooling and all the things that are coming out in this kind of a specific crisis. That said, when we did have people working at home and so on, and weren't able to go out or couldn't go out for whatever reason, and their dog jumps up on their lap during a teleconference, it was a time to breathe a little bit of enjoyment and humor into that kind of situation. We did ask people and share some best practices about how to work at home, like go to a different area where the kids aren't, and close the doors. And when daddy or mommy are working, please, you can't interrupt them because they're very important. But if something does get interrupted and so on, we add some humor to that, because there does have to be this balance between taking care of your family and what's important there, and yet still getting the work done that we have to get done for our customers.
I think the other part that Russ brings up here is it's a little bit of tone at the top. So one of the things that we've done this week is each of the senior executives of the company has done a video from home talking about the fact that, hey, you might see my kid in the background, or you might see my dog jump up on my lap, or sorry if you hear the barking in the background, to help set the tone from the top that that's the reality for everybody, right? And we get that, and we know that that's what's going to make its way into the workplace. And right now, that's fine. And so I think that one of the advice I'd give to everybody is use your executives to help set the tone at the top. Doing some short little videos is helpful. One of my peers yesterday literally gave a tour of his house to his employees. He did it on his phone, and in case you're wondering what this thing is behind me, he walked through what was in his office. He kind of showed where he was at, and they thought it was great. It made it personal, and it just, we know everybody's in the same boat right now.
That's a great idea. I like it.
So one question that, go ahead. Did anybody else have anything?
Yeah, Joe, all I was going to say is Kevin, around productivity, we've been home now for a week and a half, and the first week was just about absorbing the initial shock to the system and making sure that the thousands of people needed to be able to work remotely. And now we're kind of coming out of it where we're now again talking about what is the status of the projects. And we are seeing that the larger, more complex projects that typically really benefited from people being together, those are they're probably going to move a little slower. But the kind of the flip side to all of this and the working from home, we had a meeting yesterday where we talked about a potential large rollout that we're going to do of a new set of software. It was, the conversation pivoted. It was, all right, well, we're on schedule. Do we really want to roll this out with everybody working remotely? And that kind of goes back to the people have their kids, their dogs, end users they're in a completely different status than what they were. So that's at least a kind of a new perspective that we are applying to our releases and trying to think about just how important are the releases, how fundamentally different are these going to change people's jobs, and can they absorb it right now, or should we pause them for just a bit? But that's something I thought would be worth sharing.
A couple other questions here. How do you know when it was time to get back to normal operations?
I would say that.
Or is there a new normal, right? I think that's what Dave was saying earlier, right? Like you may want to pick and choose.
Yeah, that was what I was thinking, is that there is a time to go back to something that is more akin to what we were doing in the past, but it's also a really good time to stand back away and say, what worked better now than, is there anything that we would pick out of what we're doing now? And as the crisis dwindles and gets contained and so on, what should we do differently going back? I think that's a very worthwhile, specific action to think through. That. And I think our friends with this coronavirus issue will also pretty more input as to when the bell rings and when it's good to start going back to normal, whatever that was. On the other guy's perspective.
I think, listen, one of the things that we're doing is obviously we're following very much what the local and country-specific rules are with what we can do with our employees, and we're going to have to take signals from officials about when we can start moving from a workforce perspective back into a normal state of mind. What I actually hear from our employees is, while this is such a big change, there is a desire amongst the employee population to get back to a sense of normalcy. I think just everyone is spun up right now, and they're looking for a calm to come back to the world. And I think when we get to the point where moving back away from remote work back in the office, I think I'm already feeling a pent-up demand from our employees for that. And so I think that'll be a healthy transition for us to go through.
Yeah.
Kind of a follow-up question on that. So did your initial hypothesis of the duration of the events come close to the actual abatement in some of these earlier crises, Russ, and others?
Some of them were very quickly resolved. The virus situation was very quickly resolved. When we figured out how that we had to shut off every PC and every server and turn them on one at a time to figure out which ones were infected, which ones weren't, was the only way we could do it. And that one took us a weekend or 3 days before we could find all those machines that were infected and have them cleaned. This one could go on for some period of time. The financial crisis at Wall Street went on for some amount of time, and that was several months. There's been some, desire that, gosh, I hope this gets over soon. But on the other side of it, it may be with us for a while until we get vaccines and so on going in the country, and that's a year from now. But I can't imagine us all being bottled up for the next year. But I think it should abate. I hope that this thing will abate over this next month with as much social distancing and stay-at-home kind of things that will contain this thing to something that is more manageable than certainly it is today. On the other guy's perspective,
I think when I look at it, if you look at 9/11, there wasn't necessarily a structural issue in the economy when that happened, which caused it to, while difficult for certain industries, it snapped back relatively fast. in the financial crisis, there were structural issues in the economy that dragged that out. I think when you look at this crisis, it's not necessarily a structural issue in the economy, but it is the depth with which this is, the impact is enormous. One of the things that we're trying to guard against is while we are so aggressively going after costs, how do we make sure we're ready in case this thing snaps back faster than what we're looking at? You know, we've modeled different scenarios of how long this could go on, and we've got to make sure we game theory out what are the different snapbacks of this, whether it's a short, deep retraction versus a long, extended retraction, and we're planning for multiple scenarios.
Smart.
I think the other thing to think about, you know, I was in GE Aviation right after 9/11. I was in GE Capital right after the 2008 financial crisis. And one of the things I do think that will play into this is we're going to find that there were some things about the United States and our ability to handle the pandemic that are going to change certain industries. So if you go back to 9/11, the aviation industry changed dramatically after 9/11. If you go after 2008, financial services, insurance, all changed dramatically after the financial crisis. I think if I were in the healthcare industry, the end of this isn't going to be when we send people back to work. I think you're going to see certain industries like the medical field where we're going to look at supply chains and our inability to get goods and services in the United States. We're going to look at our inability to have enough beds available during a pandemic. I think you're going to see some huge overhauls that are driven both by the federal and local governments, as well as industries that are going to be more far-reaching than just what it takes to get through the pandemic. I think that's one learning I would have looking back at those other big crises.
So a couple of questions came in around continuing to support remote workers after this is all done. Is that something that you all collectively would consider to be the new norm?
I'll tell you, we're not planning on that to be the new norm.
Okay.
We'll feel comfortable about the fact that we tested our infrastructure to manage through this, but it will not be the new normal for us.
And it's the same for us. We actually think associates, and we're already seeing this, are going to have a desire to come back quickly. And so we've actually already spun up a team that started to look at when the government says it's ready, what is going to be our process to repatriate our associates back into the workforce and to kind of think about an orderly process to do that. We're not thinking about this being a long-term work from home scenario either.
So follow up on that. So did you do any mock training for crises with your teams before the crisis, and do you plan on doing it after? Jim, I think you had talked about the FMEA and some of the different new workloads that you're now looking at or have been exposed. Had you done that from a leadership team perspective before this?
You know, I've been in this job for 1.5 years, and I can tell you on the first week I was in the job, a woman named Joni came to visit me with a book and with an application for my iPhone, and it was my crisis planning brief. And literally there is a book for our board of directors, and there's a book, and it's an electronic book. There's a physical and electronic version of it that each one of it has. And there are certain crises where I'm in charge, where my HR leader's in charge, where the CEO is in charge. And we drill those twice a year, once a year with the board. It blew me away. It was one of the things that Nationwide had when I came in that I was just really very pleasantly surprised to find. It goes down to literally multiple scenarios and what the plans are. And there are scenario owners with each of the business and functions. And literally my second month on the job was our first test. And we ran a chemical spill test in downtown Columbus that included the board. And we walked through what are all the steps that we would do. And we took a 3-hour chunk of the afternoon with the complete leadership team and board of directors to actually practice. So like I said, when this came up and we declared the disaster January 29th, it was almost rote for us. There was a set of steps we worked through and we followed the process, and that made it very simple and easy for us to go through. I'd never have a job like this again where we didn't have that kind of a process in place.
So it sounds like it worked really well for you. Dave?
And I would echo the same thing. We have a pretty extensive crisis management process within our industry, just because, as you can imagine, anytime there is an event that impacts the safety of the flying public, we have to go into a crisis management mode. So we exercise that process and train on that on a regular basis with the executive team. We also just, with the number of planes flying around the world and the number of times you have a bird go through a jet engine or something along those lines, just naturally that process runs many times throughout the year. So we've been able to fall back on our crisis management process. I will tell you, we had not drilled a pandemic, at least at my time on the leadership team. So we didn't necessarily drill for this crisis, but we have drilled for others, which made the process to manage through this far less exciting, if you will.
So, but I think the recommendation would be, if you don't have one, get one, and practice it.
Managing a crisis happens in the off season, and that's one of the things that's helped us.
It's an absolute great point.
Okay, here, let me just do a couple of house cleaning things here. So I think some of the questions have kind of abated at this point. We are recording this session for everyone that is that are the attendees. We will make it available. And it's usually taking somewhere right around 24 hours or so to turn around recorded video on WebEx at this point. So rest assured, if you missed the first part of the presentation and you joined late, you'll have the opportunity to take advantage of the book of knowledge here that we created this morning. Is there any other questions? We'll let the attendees hit real quick and get those typed up into the chat window. And I guess at this point, we're just a little over an hour into the presentation. We're 6 minutes over, actually. But we've got this blocked off until 10 o'clock. We didn't really want to cut the conversation short. Is there any other items that you collectively, if you started thinking about the different industries that are here? We've got some folks that are in transportation. We have some that are in healthcare. Some of the attendees are in retail. We've got some folks that are in the grocery business as well. So is there other things that the panelists and could bring to the table around some closing thoughts?
I mean, I think the only thing that I would close with is, obviously, in all of our companies, our people are our biggest assets. And so making sure we're looking out for them, understanding the stress that they're under. And I know one of the things that I'm personally trying to do is make sure I just make personal phone calls to check in on people, not when I need something, but when I don't need something. And I don't think any of us can over appreciate how difficult this is on our employees and the stresses that they're under. So let's all not forget to take care of those that make us great companies.
Yeah, and I'll echo what David said, and staying in touch with your employees, and making sure that you are asking them how they're doing and checking in with them. One point, Joe, that I thought came to mind is that we all go through annual capital planning cycles, and there's that never-ending debate as to, do you have to do certain projects? Can we defer them? And I think it's really important for people to speak up and make sure the leadership's aware of why certain infrastructure projects are needed. They don't always sound real sexy, but they're really important right around now. So that would be something else I would share.
The only other thing I might summarize is two things, really. One is, thank you all for joining this. It's and a special thanks to Cincinnati Bell CBTS for hosting it. But I would say that reaching out to this community for help, for thoughts. I'm struggling with this. Hey, I found something that's really good. Did you see something else? I think that is something that having that kind of friendship across and community across all of us is a really, really good thing, especially in times like this. And the second thing I would just emphasize again is take care of the employees. And I love picking up the phone and calling individuals. You can't get there by walking around these days to see people in the hallways and stuff, but picking up the phone, it's amazing that connection and how valuable those relationships are. So thank you.
Okay, so, I've taken a couple other, I've just been writing as we've gone along, and some of the key things that I've heard today also were, the silver lining in this is there's an opportunities to improve, whether that's business as usual processes, new things that are going to be spurred because of the remote workforce that we're kind of stuck in today. So keep an eye on that for the future. Dave, you had mentioned, leaders being competent. Our employees are looking at us to be competent, not nice, and to be trustworthy and honest. So that was another, I think, key takeaway. Jim, from what you said, those business processes, we need to continually, test those and make sure that if we have a new process in the future, or even in this critical world where we haven't even thought, okay, what's plan B here for Skype, or what's plan B for WebEx, or what if my VPN goes down, or the 5G networks go down, what does that look like? So, or 4G networks, so what does that look like? How do we survive that? How do we communicate is some key things. Dave, from you, I also had watch the store. There are bad actors that are out there that are constantly going to take advantage of this situation. So engage with your security teams and really watch for phishing opportunities for our remote employees, because there's a siphon back in through the back door through VPN that could impact us all. And it's funny, I've been looking at some of the chats, and one of our attendees kind of put a thought together. She said, you know what? Start every meeting with a caring moment to really engage our employee base. So that's something that she kind of wanted to put forth as well. So with that, Jeff, I'm going to turn it back over to you if you want to have any closing thoughts before we go ahead and stop the recording.
Thank you. Again, I just echo everybody else's sentiments here that, this is a time that sharing, our experiences in a situation like this, we all share this blue planet, and so something like this, I think, brings people together. It can be difficult to do when you're sitting in your home office, but I just appreciate everybody's willingness to contribute to what we're trying to accomplish here, which is share information. And again, I'd like to thank you for all the thoughts. And we will digest the outcome of this, and I think we've got a couple of other similar concepts that we're going to promote and webinars around as we move forward, security being one of them. And I think just some of the technological considerations around communication that may drill a little more deeply into specific items. I thought this was a great session, and again, appreciate everybody's contribution to it.
Well, thanks, Jeff. And I think with this, one of the things we're going to be sending out a survey to the attendees and to the panelists as well. If there are comments that you have, please put those into the survey. We will continue to adjust. And really the key thing, I think, is building community and making sure, Dave, I hope, and Jim, I hope that we really come together through this. I unfortunately, with the panelists and with the customers, CC'd instead of BCC'd. And maybe that's not a bad thing, so that you can potentially reach out and drive further conversations. We will continue to try to strive to bring folks together during this crisis. And with that, I'll say good morning and hopefully and wish you all the best.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Be safe. Thank you.
Bye-bye.